Right. Good evening. Welcome to Scrutiny Panel 4. My name is Councillor Paul Driscoll and I'm chairing the meeting this evening. And the theme for the Scrutiny Panel is the Climate and Ecological Emergency Strategy. And in this meeting, we're discussing the food systems and a planet-friendly diet. So we're starting just a little bit late, and the reason for that is there was a briefing regarding COVID for councillors, and consequently several councillors were at that meeting, so that's why we're just starting a few minutes late. So without further ado, we're going to go through the meeting agenda. So we're on Zoom this evening. There's a chat function in that, and that's just used to manage the meeting for the participants. It's not used for a discussion outside of the meeting. So just to let any viewers on YouTube know that when we talk about the chat function, that's what we're referring to, just the management of the meeting. So we're going to use the hands up function to indicate a desire to speak at a meeting, and we'll make sure that we're moving along quite at a brisk pace. If the papers are all on the council website under Scrutiny Review Panel 4, Climate Emergency Agenda papers for this evening, so all the papers can be found there. So if we just start with the apologies for absence, so I have apologies from Councillor Summers, and also congratulations to Councillor Summers, who's just had a new baby, so has had to send his apologies for this evening. We've also had apologies from Pauline Shakespeare, from Plot to Plate Food and Wellbeing Grower, and Mind Food representative. We've also had apologies from Claire Pritchard, who's a Chief Executive Officer from Greenwich Cooperative Development Agency and the Chair of the Mayor of London's Food Board. So I've not had any other matters or urgent matters notified to me, so I take it that there are none. And there are no matters to be considered in private. The next item on the agenda is declarations of interest. So I've had, just to let you know, Councillor Chauhan on a previous meeting was declaring that she does PhD and postdoctoral research in sustainability and food sustainability. It's not a pecuniary declaration, but just to inform the meeting for the record. Are there any other declarations of interest? No other declarations. We've got the minutes from the previous meeting. So I don't know if there's any corrections from those minutes that need to be taken at this time. Any corrections from those? No. And are there any matters arising from those at this moment? No matters arising. So do we take it that the minutes are approved of the previous meeting?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much. So the minutes are approved of the previous meeting. Thank you very much for that. So that's the preliminary business concluded there. We're now going to go into the substantive item, which is the Climate and Ecological Emergency Food Systems Planet-Friendly Diet. So we've got Joe Mortensen, who's one of the lead officers with Maria Nolan on this from Ealing. We also have Will Blake, who's from Horsenden Farm CIC, and we also have Penny Walk from Northfields Dean Allotments as well as participants. So Joe's going to kick off giving an outline of the paper that she has, and then we're going to get a brief outline from Will and Penny about their organisations. Just to let everybody know that often Scrutiny reviews previous actions, but we're in the position now at looking at a very embryonic stage of our policy. So we're looking at things that are going in the future. So, and we're inputting into at the very earliest point, which is often an unusual point for Scrutiny to be in. Normally looking in retrospect. So if the discussion is kept in mind that this is a very embryonic stage. So can I hand over to Jo to go through and outline the paper that she has and give her input there? That would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just sharing a screen now with a few slides to help us work through. Excellent. Great. So it's nice to see everyone again, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to attend the meeting and share with you the work that we're doing on food in support of the climate and ecological emergency strategy. As you know from our last meeting, and just for the benefit of the audience, Ealing declared a climate emergency in April of 2019. And as a result of that, we created a strategy over the last year and a half, which the overall aim of that strategy is to become carbon neutral as an organization and as a borough by 2030. In that strategy, we outlined 5 topics where we felt like the council had a great level of control and influence over. Those are energy, nature, travel, waste, and food systems. The first 4 were adopted substantially as our strategy, our climate and ecological emergency strategy, through Cabinet in January. And the 5th aspect of the strategy, our food systems aspect, was deferred to a community co-designed process that we are just about to begin. So I just am going to go very briefly into you've seen the slide last time if you attended the meeting. This is where our carbon emissions come from in Ealing. A note that these are production-based emissions. So this is what we're sort of working with in terms of that goal to become carbon neutral. We see a third sort of coming from transport, a third from domestic energy, and a third from industrial and commercial. I think it's important just to go back and remind everyone the difference between production emissions and consumption emissions. So production, a shorthand for production emissions, is you can think of those as the carbon emissions that come directly from the burning of fossil fuels within the borough. So travel and our boilers in most of our homes are really good examples of that. Consumption emissions are a little more complicated, a lot more complicated, and they would be in every object that we have. So it would be a representation of all of the mining or the farming, the manufacturing, the transport, the packaging, all of the carbon emissions associated with getting these items created in our lives are considered consumption emissions or consumed emissions. And that's important because in relation to carbon and food, the opportunity for impact really is around consumption-based emissions. So on the right-hand side, I've just taken a clip of one of the graphics that I put into the paper that's from the C40 Cities study that was done on consumption-based emissions. And C40 Cities is a resource that I use quite a lot. It's I can't remember exactly. I think I've put in the report, I believe it's something like 95 of the biggest urban areas in the world have made commitments to detailing how we can reduce carbon emissions and recognizing the importance of urban centers and the impact that they have on climate change. And so C40 Cities sort of coordinates that effort and brings forward studies and best practice and sort of network learning on how we can do better, basically. And so this report on consumption-based emissions was really illuminating around the area of food. And what they said in the food chapter of this study is that they've set 2 scenarios, two sort of target scenarios. One on the left-hand side of the screen was the ambitious target, and the one on the right is progressive. So these are areas of key interventions or key suggestions for how we could make carbon reduction through our food system. The ambitious target gets us to a 60% reduction in consumption emissions by 2030. And the progressive target doesn't get us too far off that ambitious target, but only giving us a 51% reduction. But you can see sort of how they modeled the different behaviors and the impacts that it would have. But basically, this is a very, the point to showing you this slide is to show you the importance of our food systems in relation to carbon emissions and how we might not see them appear on our graphic, our pie of carbon emissions, because we're tracking production emissions, because that's the data set we have. And you can imagine that consumption-based emissions are really difficult to track, but nonetheless important. And I think it's also important to note now that there's a working group that I'm a part of from London Councils, which is a group that works on behalf of all London local authorities. And we have been part of a working group that is focusing specifically on consumption-based emissions and what we can do as Londoners, as London as a whole, to as interventions. And so we've got a study going on right now to help us further identify and drill down about the consumption-based emissions for London and on a borough-wide level. So we should have that data coming forward to support us with a little bit more granularity soon. The next is just a reminder of how we developed the strategy as a whole and where we are now. So when we looked at putting together our response to the climate emergency, we looked at what the council controls and what we directly influence. And the thinking was that we would start there and set a leadership model, and then we would take our indirect influence as sort of the next step, something that we are obviously concurrently developing, but it's the more difficult. You can see in the box there, it's working with residents and local businesses. It's our influence, really. So like I said, we are moving all of those ideas forward. That's through our engagement activities and through this piece of the strategy by really trying to ask the community to help us out with this piece of the strategy in a really big way, because what we realized was that the community is really doing most of the heavy lifting on this topic of food systems and sustainability in the borough. And there's a huge amount going on right now. And I also just wanted to note that, oops, sorry, I'm gonna, that a year ago, when we were just about to go out for consultation and further discussion with the community around our strategy as a whole, we went out with some survey questions to our online resident panel. And I believe we had about 500 responses. So it's not everyone in the borough that's told us this, but one of our questions was around how interested our audience would be in creating more opportunities to choose locally produced food that has a lower environmental impact. And if you look at the grid that is up there, the table that's up there, the slice of the table, you'll see that 71% of respondents were either extremely interested or very interested in this topic. So I think that just gives us sort of further information to know that we're doing the right thing to grasp this topic as something that's very important to our residents. We have multiple benefits that can be reaped from securing a climate-friendly food system. So we understand that the climate action, the climate and ecological emergency strategy is very much carbon and biodiversity ecology focused. But it's impossible to talk about food systems without acknowledging all of the web, really, of interconnectedness around food systems. So we have issues that we've definitely seen come right, to the front and center around food poverty, and this last year has really given us a close look at that and how deep that impact is, where people are making the decision whether or not to heat their homes or feed their families. So there's obviously huge issues of social justice and environmental justice in the food systems area, which is an area of the strategy that we wanted to pick up on, acknowledge, and really make sure that we do appropriate focus on that. There's areas around public health, so accessing fresh food, mental health and well-being, which I think we'll hear more of on that side from our members of the community that are here to talk to us tonight. The ecology and biodiversity side definitely comes into play as we use sort of these food growing spaces to create tiny habitats where, end up being really important for pollinators and small mammals. And also not to forget the community connections that I think if you've grown food in the last year, certainly you've really probably been touched by how important that connection is back to your community when you're doing something like growing your own food. And finally, recognizing also the importance and the interconnectedness of food rescue and redistribution, and how important that's been, not only in the last year, although again, that's been really sort of escalated in the last year, but I'm talking about groups such as the Felix Project and City Harvest, which are operating, which are located in the borough, which are rescuing food that would otherwise be wasted, and getting that into the hands of people who will put it to good use. So just a summary of where we are with the strategy, and where we believe that we will be taking it in terms of developing out this theme of the strategy. The intentions are for us to map what work is currently happening, because we know that we have a really rich palette of food growing, food redistribution. Just it's impossible sort of to not see all of those linkages across the borough and all the good work that's going on. So we would like to do some mapping and really get a sense of where we stand in the borough, and look at if there are any gaps in the system, or potentially any any capacity building that we can help out with for the organizations that are really making a move in these areas. We want to look at what the council's actions and powers are with relation to food systems, because we do have some areas that we can be influential and we do have control over. And finally, as I said, we want to identify what we can do to support community organizations to really take it to the next level and support the good work that's already happening. So that's my overview. On my next slide, I have sort of the draft objectives that were at the end of the paper for tonight, but I'm going to leave it there for right now, and we can return to that slide later after we've heard from the members of the community, if that's okay with the chair.
Thank you very much, Jo. Thank you. We have Will Blake from Horsington Farm CIC. Will has said that he might have to leave at around about 8 o'clock-ish, so just to give people notice of that. So Will's going to give an introduction about the organisation and the purpose and role and what happens there. So Will, if I can ask you to give us the outline of your organisation and what you do and how you do it. Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you. And thank you very much for inviting us along tonight. I really appreciate it. So Horsington Farm CIC. For those that don't know, CIC stands for Community Interest Company, which I think is important considering what we're discussing tonight. It's very much the purpose of why we set it up like that. It's about community investment, community support, and obviously growing food and re-establishing a small urban farm on the outskirts of London, excuse me, to, again, answer some of the questions that have been put tonight in terms of how we can grow locally, how we can establish a small farm in an urban environment, and what that looks like, and also basing it around a community function. So how can we bring the community together, both from volunteers and to supporting probably a very small number of jobs, but then also giving back in terms of both environmentally and social benefits as well. So the farm started, well, there's been a farm at Horsington for, I think, hundreds of years actually. It goes back quite a long way. It's got quite a long historical link to the area. And I think it was the actual farm building itself was probably abandoned in about the 50s. Anyway, the area is on the canal coming into Ealing, and was left to pretty much rack and ruin for quite a long time. And it's only in the last 10 to 15 years that it's really been renovated, and that's primarily thanks to the council, but also to a local friends group that was set up, the Friends of Horsington Hill, who've done a huge amount in terms of bringing that space back into some usability, as it were. The CIC itself, which I'm responsible for, I'm involved with, started really out of the first lockdown. So out of the ashes rose a small little phoenix, as it were. And we had the opportunity to take on quite a large area of the farm in terms of its growing space. And we had a very quick turnaround last year, considering March is when you would normally hope to be planting out for the first time. We started sowing seeds in late March. So we managed to get some stuff in the ground quite quickly. and we managed to produce you know, a small amount last year, which we sold through our farm shop, which has gone from strength to strength. If anyone's been there on a Wednesday or a Saturday will know the rather long queue that is now developing. I do apologise, we are working on it. So there's a focus on the growing. We've also introduced a small flock of chickens, so we could produce our own eggs, and we're actually looking, excuse me, to acquire a small herd, sorry, so 2 head of cattle, and we're looking at native breeds, Shetlands, to help primarily with conservation grazing on the hill, but will also provide for a small number of people in the first instances, milk and cream, etc. So we're trying to be self-sufficient, self-sustaining, and the benefit as well is then providing the opportunity for local volunteers to come along to either learn or just to be outside and to contribute to the development of the farm, whether it be sowing, planting, or caring for animals, hopefully at some point in the future. And there is another aspiration as well to set up an education programme to run alongside that, which I hope will encourage schools to have a day on the farm type programme where children can learn about the importance of soil and regenerative agriculture, what that means, along with things like agroforestry, why it's important to have cows in the fields, in the woods, and hopefully by then we might even be having a few chickens and pigs running around in there, and the benefits that they provide in terms of encouraging biodiversity. And I think one of the underlying messages of that, and it's interesting in the slide where they looked at ambitious targets of no meat production or no meat consumption. I think one of the key education points that we want to try and get across, it's not so much about what you eat, although that is important obviously from a dietary point of view, but it's how that food is produced. And so I think a key tenet of what we are trying to do is to produce food that is sustainable and is complementary to the land that it's on. So we practice things like permaculture or no dig, some people may have heard of, in how we grow our food, with a focus on regenerating the soil, improving soil health, so that there's no need for artificial inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. And then obviously the livestock will eventually also provide a complementary benefit as well in terms of the impact that they have on the environment. And so we also have other groups that are kind of coming in and out of the farm. So Ealing Wildlife Group, for example, they're establishing barn owls, etc., and other top predators on the hill. There's also wider encouragement for small mammals as well on the hill, so outside of the main farm area. Again, hopefully the practices that we're instilling at the farm will benefit those species. So I think that's it in a small nutshell. We're still very early days, and we're coming into our second, but probably first real full season where we got access to wider growing area and establishing that for hopefully what will become a much more sustainable production of food, and will hopefully to introduce a community supported agricultural model where once we can get a handle on how much produce we're producing and the consistency of that, then we can go out to the public and look probably to set up some type of subscription-based model where people can pay a subscription, and for that they will get a veg box a week, which will include various other things as well. So that's the aspiration, and I think that community-supported agricultural model is something that can be supported going forward. Certainly there's examples of it now popping up all over the country, and I think it's something that is, considering we're in an urban environment, you've got a huge catchment, and if there is a way of being able to scale that up, I think would be a huge benefit. And I think where we've been successful and where Horsendon's been successful is that our relative barrier to entry has been pretty low. So we work very closely with one of our rangers and the council as a result of that. And it's very much about co-responsibility. So our barrier to entry in terms of using the land has been fairly low. So we don't have the pressure, financial pressure over us in that sense. But what we're doing is we are reinvesting into the site to improve it, to provide a service in a sense as well for volunteers and other people to come along who may require, from a mental health perspective or a physical health perspective, but also just a general, I need to get out and I want to do something and I want to support my community approach as well. So it's working very closely with each other, having clear lines of communication and things like that to make that work. But I think that barrier to entry is really important. It has been, I think there's been a huge benefit to why the site has become very successful over the last few years.
All right. Thank you very much.
Not just with us, but other groups as well.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think it's a good potted history of the work that you're undertaking, and give me a new insight into, I've often heard the name Horsenden Hill Farm, but it's good to know a bit more about it and that background. That's been really helpful. So I'm going to go to Penny now. So Penny Walk from Northfield's Dean Allotments. So Penny, would you like to give an introduction about the role of your organisation, a bit of background? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting us this evening. I hope that everybody here has had time to eat this evening. I have to say that the main part of my meal was roast vegetables, which I've grown myself, and they included a leek that took no more than 20 minutes from soil to plate. The flavour was amazing, much fuller and sweeter than anything you can buy in the shops, and it's good to know it was grown without chemicals. So yes, it's organic. Food miles? None. A few food meters, that's all. Cost? Pennies. Needless to say, this food came from my plot. What I'd like to talk about this evening is how an allotment can improve the quality of your life. It's a place to grow great food, but it's also a place that enables personal growth. You get lots of exercise. There's companionship if you want it. And it enables, I truly, truly believe this, it enables community growth. I think that's a huge part of any allotments. It's a way of life. And for very many of us, it's life enhancing. So what is an allotment? Rather a basic question, but I think it's worth covering. It's a piece of land that you rent in order to grow vegetables and fruit, and some sites allow you to grow flowers as well. The allotment system is a model for producing healthy, sustainable food. And so as we look at the carbon footprint created by mass food production, it's very relevant at the moment to think about how the allotment model might be extended. And for this reason, I've been asked to tell you a bit about the history of allotments and how our site works. Northfield allotments are the oldest in London. They date from 1832, when the then Bishop of London gave the land on either side of Northfield Avenue to the people of London in perpetuity to grow their food. In 1939, over 100 years later, the government started a Dig for Victory campaign to feed the country. And in Ealing, 70% of Lammas Park was turned over to allotments, all of Blondin Park and 40% of Ealing Common. And the boot, interestingly, the boot on the very famous Dig for Victory campaign, that came from an allotment holder in Acton. The government stated at that time that a standard size allotment would keep a family of 5 in vegetables for 8 months of the year. And by the end of the Second World War, there were 1.4 million allotments in the UK. My granddad had one of them, and my dad remembers the war. My dad's 92. He remembers the war as a time of plentiful food, delicious food. And that was entirely because of his own dad's allotment. By the 1970s, as we all know, allotments had waned in popularity, and half of the Northfield site was swallowed up by development. In 2016, only 5 years ago, developers threatened the rest of the site, but with the support of the community, we were able to see them off. The pandemic has changed things again. It's very, very significant because people were working from home, and there seems to be much more value attached to outside space. And over the last year, gardening has emerged as the second most popular pastime after watching television. And waiting lists for allotments have reached unprecedented levels. At Northfields, our list has increased from around 50 to 60 to 220. And out of the last 15 people who've become tenants on our site, 2 were families with young children, 1 was a couple nearing retirement, and 12 were young, childless, and living in rented flats with no outside space. In other ways, socially and in terms of ethnicity, our plot holders reflect the diversity of the wider community. It's an extremely diverse site, and that's one of the glories of it, really. The Northfield site is owned by Pathways, which is a housing charity. Management is done on behalf of Pathways by a volunteer committee elected by the plot holders. Most allotment sites are owned by the council, but they're still managed by volunteer committees. At Northfields, the committee administers the waiting list. We encourage good standards of cultivation, which means we inspect plots a couple of times a year, and we maintain the communal areas. We also collect the rent for the starter plots, which cost £30 a year. In our case, Pathways collects the rest of the rent, £66 a year for a half plot, £120 for a full plot, although at many sites, rent collection is also done by the committee. So as you will take away from that, the committee, these volunteer committees do a lot of work. But without that kind of management, I don't think that allotments would function. Plots are rented to people on the waiting list on a strict first come, first served basis. Our plot holders start with a small bed in a shared plot. This enables people to work out whether they've got the time for it, because an allotment is a big commitment, and whether they enjoy it. If they like it, as bigger plots become available, they progress to a half plot, which will average around 16 to 18 metres, 16, by 8 metres. And some people who are very enthusiastic move on to a full plot, which is double that size. We have 170 plots, which are allocated as they become vacant. And that means people have either given them up, or they've been asked to give up their plot because they've not been cultivating it in an adequate way. The allotments are governed by a legally binding tenancy agreement, which is signed by each plot holder. It is a formal document, and it sets out the do's and don'ts, everything from being respectful and pleasant to people, to not stealing, to ensuring that your plot that 75% of your plot is cultivated. And it commits you as a plot holder to growing, in our case, food, vegetables and fruit. And when we do allow people to grow flowers too. The produce is for your own use and your family's. You can't sell it. And while we very much like the idea of giving surplus food to organisations like food banks, it's not something we've been able to do, because food banks need specific amounts, quite large amounts of produce at regular times, and we can't offer that. But we can give food away, and I think that's what most of us do. So you'll find that the neighbours and the friends of people who've got allotments eat rather good vegetables and fruit. And I just find it a lovely thing to do, to be able to knock on my neighbour's door and give them some rhubarb or whatever it is. What's not to like about that? It's great. We actively engage the local community in other ways as well. Outside COVID times, I mean, obviously the site is relatively shut down at the moment, and there were very few visitors. But usually we invite people to join our monthly maintenance days, people from the wider community. And on a couple of days a year, we have free events when we open the sites to visitors. So at our summer open day, people can have a good nosy around the site, which they love. We generally get about 1,000 people to that. We sell plants we've grown, we give them cups of tea, we make cakes, we do barbecue sausages, there's a bar, and we sell jam, we sell produce, and it's a really, really lovely day. Our Halloween pumpkin trail, where we have all sorts of ghosties and ghoulies, is even more popular. We get about 4,000 people to that. And both of these events have become really quite significant and I think cherished events in the local calendar. Now, one very striking thing to me about allotments is that they are full of kindness. We share things, we share seeds, we share seedlings, we give each other things, and we understand that what binds us is this commitment to grow food. It's very easy to talk to somebody who you don't know well because you're talking about your tomatoes or your onions or your potatoes or whatever it is. And it's very, very easy and it's absolutely delightful. And it's quite possible that the only thing you know about this person is that they grow amazing broad beans. They might be a High Court judge. They might be an HGV driver. You have absolutely no idea. And I think that's another great thing about allotments. They're a great leveler. So before you know it, you're part of a social club, which there are people who prefer not to engage, but most of us do. And it's just wonderful. It's delightful. So one more thing, you get fitter, or at least I did when I got my plot. You're outside in the fresh air. You're moving around on your feet, crouching down. Who needs the gym? We don't. And it's very well documented that gardening is good for mental health as well. Personally, I regard going through the allotment gates as entering a magical kingdom where I can leave behind any worries I have and focus on growth. And when I talk about growth, of course, I mean growing food. And I'm really looking forward to the broccoli where the little purple flowers are just coming out. But I'm also talking about the kind of positive personal growth that's facilitated by being part of a strong, warm, and purposeful community.
Thank you very much, Penny. Thank you. That was very comprehensive, and I can attest to visiting Northfield's allotment both for the Halloween and for the summer opening, and I don't think I'll ever forget seeing various skeletons in wheelbarrows around the site. So it is, there's a real connection with people going to visit, and it's part of almost the Northfield calendar now. And it's a real shame that's one of the impacts of COVID that hasn't happened this year, because it really does attract masses of, well, 1,000 people in the summer, 4,000 in the autumn, you know, terrific numbers on these days. So thank you very much for that background. So thank you for that. Just to also let the panel know that we were going to get a contribution from Greenwich Co-op Development Agency. They couldn't make the meeting, but they've circulated, and it was circulated prior to the meeting, their PowerPoint, because they've had about 20 years of involvement in food systems and supporting community initiatives. So just to let people know that that's gone out. Joe, did you want to pitch in anything feedback about that at this point? So I think Joe's got some slides there that were circulated previously. So it's just a couple of highlights of those points there, just so people can be aware.
Sorry, I was just having trouble finding my unmute.
Yeah, okay.
So I just wanted to share a few slides. A few of us before this meeting had the privilege of speaking with Claire, who Councillor Driscoll described earlier as the lead of the Greenwich Food Partnership, and also quite a influential member at GLA, who's working on food systems across the city and has amazing ideas and tremendous energy around food systems and sustainable food systems. So I was just going to show a few of the slides that she's put in the pack and offered around to the scrutiny panel about their existence. And she described that they've been, it says it's been 20 years, but I thought she said 40 years in our discussion, to be honest, like some sort of roots of 40 years.
That was the co-op development agency's 40 years, but their food program is 20 years.
Yeah, so they've got, you know, a rich history of really weaving together all of the various aspects of work that is being done on food in the borough. And this really sounds like it really sprouted up from a community-led position, although the council did support it, and we understand that it's sort of the main connection to the council is through the public health team within the organization, which sits in their sort of parks and leisure section. So this is just one of the slides that tells about sort of their history of how they've evolved over time. And hopefully, yeah, and they get a lot of support from a framework called Sustainable Food Places, which is something that is we were just learning about recently. So it basically takes that whole web that we were talking about, that we've all sort of touched on, the mental health, the physical health, the sustainability side of food, and sort of helps pull it all together and gives it a really coherent sort of framework for how a community works on food together. And finally, these are the 6 sort of key issues that they work from to take action. So I really just wanted to share this back in sort of to seed the discussion for later of how we might frame our own objectives for our strategy. So those are just the 3 I wanted to share. Councillor Driscoll,
Thank you. And the Greenwich Co-op Development Agency mentioned, highlighted they have a food co-op, which started with a few volunteers and a bit of community support from the council, but now has, I think, 5 employees, a wholesale side, and runs a number of market stalls as well. So from very embryonic, very trial and error starting point. And I think I drew some comparisons with Horsenden Farm, the embryonic stage with a few people, how now it's got a wholesale side plus a retail side and employs 5 people. So it took years to develop, but that does show a lot of promise for the future. So having said that, so I'll just open it now for contributions or questions and comments, either about the paper or for participants and the councillors to coming with contributions about how do you think we should go forward with our food policy going forward? Thank you. So if there's any indications with hands up, that would be great. And I'm looking at the chat and the participants list now. I mean, if I kick, I see just Kieran, Councillor Johan, would you like to come in? Thank you.
I have, as you can imagine, and as last week, too many questions. So I don't know how it's best to like organise this. I think maybe I'll start with asking some questions to our participants, if that's okay. I'm a councillor in Southall, and I'm really interested to hear about the work that you're doing, Penny, in the allotments. I know we've got, I think it's 2 allotments in Southall in particular. I wonder whether there could be more connectivity between the allotments across the borough to see how we can bring in people from, say, in our area, lower income people in particular, into that allotment space. I know you're very right. I mean, we pre-COVID got bags of potatoes from a member of the family who does have an allotment, and giant pumpkins. So we very much like I know that system also exists amongst our BAME community as well. I just wonder how allotments can sort of learn from experiences in other parts of the borough, and I suppose linking that to an objective of what we could do, we could propose for the document, is how do we facilitate opening up more space in the borough to use as allotments, and you putting that potentially. I know that the council currently has three priority objectives that it goes through before deciding that it's going to dispose of land and sell it, whether we can put having allotment spaces as one of those objectives, because I know that there is a lot of pressure even within Southall for that, and potentially even having that as like a core recommendation within planning applications. And to William, I think it's really, really interesting what you guys are doing in Horsenden Hill. I've done a lot of work around agroecology in particular, and did a bit of research on the CSA network and the way that it performed during the pandemic. So I'd be really interested in sort of understanding and even feeding in, if that's in any way helpful for you guys, into that process of becoming a CSA. I know that there's a big CSA that's up in St Albans. I wonder whether there's, you know, any interconnection there to learn from their experience. And yeah, but I won't bleat on. Those are sort of just to start with.
So Penny, can I invite you to come in and give any response to that? And I know Will has been wanted to come in as well, and I see Councillor Martin has got a hand up as well. So if Penny, Will, then Councillor Martin.
Yes, I mean, one thing, there is an organisation called the Ealing Allotment Partnership, which consists of basically the chairs stroke managers of all the allotment sites in the borough of Ealing. So there is a group which talks to, you know, a group of representatives from each site who talk to each other on a regular basis. And who are very active, and they have a website. So firstly, that exists. I mean, there is absolutely no question, you know, I gave you the figures on our waiting list. There is absolutely no doubt at all about the extraordinary demand for allotment space at the moment. We don't have any sort of interview system. We simply, if you are at the top of our waiting list, then you will be, I mean, somebody emailed me this afternoon and said that they're giving up a small plot. So tomorrow I will go to our waiting list. I will contact the person at the top of the list. It doesn't matter who they are, what their circumstances are. They won't be interviewed. And so anybody can join a waiting list. I mean, that's one thing to get across. There's no selection process. The only thing that we ask is that you sign the tenancy agreement and cultivate your plot and behave yourself, basically. It's not complicated. It's not difficult for anybody to access. And currently, although I did read a few days ago that some allotment rental is some councils in other boroughs are putting rentals up, but currently the cost is minimal. So, you know, people can afford £30 for a year for a starter plot. People can afford £66 a year for a half plot. And the cost of actually running your plots, it's just one of the cheapest hobbies or pastimes that I can imagine. So I don't think, in fact, there are any financial barriers to stopping people without means to, I don't think there are any barriers to stopping people without means to engaging with the allotment system. I mean, clearly there's demand for more allotments. If the land can be found, I think it would be absolutely brilliant. People are living in, we all know people are living in smaller spaces without outdoor space. I don't think the demand's going to go away.
Right. Thanks, Penny. So, Will, you wanting to come in as well? You might be muted. Yeah.
No, I've got it. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the hand waving emoji. Sorry, got it. Just going back to the CSA network. Yes, I very much kind of taking on what has happened in Greenwich is very much our aspiration too, is to be able to support a core group of people who obviously earn a living through it, but through that expand the production of the site and the farm and what it does. So I think we've all been tied because of current restrictions, and so there are a number of places that I'm desperate to go and visit and go and see. Organically is another similar site that's in North London, who runs something similar but are very much focused on growing. Again, they have a big community outreach, and they've actually got a program where they support people who actually want to set up small holdings, pretty much in an urban setting as well. So that's an interesting concept to explore, and they train people up, and I think people start as volunteers or they actually go on a proper training program with them. So there's myriad avenues of which to explore. I think just touching on a point as well that came up regarding the allotments, and I think my point that I tried to make as well about the fact that we've been lucky and that our barrier to entry has been fairly low. There's clearly some momentum has built up as a result of the pandemic, and whether that is going to dissipate or not, I think there's a great opportunity now to try and push that on, and whether it is something that was within the council's direct control of planning criteria or whatever it may be, and to assess the amount of land that is available, what could be made over to allotments, or what could be made over to organised community groups who want to manage this land, whether it be for food growing or a combination of that with rewilding or environmental benefits that support other services as well, from health and well-being. So I think there's a number of things. I think there's also, because we live in an urban environment, we get creative. I mean, we're constantly told that more and more people are living in urban environments, although I think this year, because of the pandemic, London has seen a reduction of population by over 700,000 people, which has not been seen for decades, I think. And they think that's a real sea change in what might happen. So again, what impact does that have? What impact is the pandemic going to have on things like our commercial areas? And do we get creative with our CBDs, as it were? And how can we make small areas of land, albeit if it's on top of a building or the side of a building, over to be able to grow things, whether it's vegetables, plants, or whatever it may be. So whilst we have allotments and what we've got at the farm as very prescriptive, they're very obvious places to grow, I think we also need to think about how we can be creative, and again, how we improve the access to that, to those sites. I think accessibility is important. Affordability, Penny touched on it as well. You know, seeds don't really cost very much money, and if you've got a bit of land, you can actually probably grow quite a bit, and with a little bit of training or a bit of encouragement, you can do quite a lot. And that's where I think education, therefore, is also important. And again, whether it's the big subject matter of how farming is done on a sustainable, regeneratively and sustainably, but producing good food, but equally education about food, diet, and how to grow those more direct influences on us as well. So I think those are the things that I wanted to try and get across, really.
Thanks, Will. There, I know Councillor Chauhan has come in just to come back on some of the points that have been raised there, then go to Councillor Martin. So Councillor Chauhan, did you want to come back on some of those?
Yeah, sorry Dee, I'll only be 1 second. I think listening to what William is saying, I'm reminded of a project in King's Cross as well, where there was an organisation using skips, I think, to grow food in. So I know that we've got so many construction companies in the area, we've got parking lots, I guess it's about being creative about space and thinking about the utensils and the equipment that we've got at hand and how we can repurpose those. And what I understand, I think that organization, I couldn't remember, I was trying to look it up before the meeting and I couldn't remember the name of it, but they were linking up with schools as well, using it as a sort of apprenticeship model around food growing. And I think that's another key objective that we could look at in the report, is how do we link up our apprenticeship model in the council to think about horticulture, to think about organic, permaculture, training up adults and young people and having those tools and services available, as well as apprenticeships that can help to, rethink about agriculture instead of something that's a hobby, also as a source of employment as well. And it can be it's a really creative sector. I think that's, with Brexit and everything, is going to prove to be even more important as we go ahead. Sorry, that was it.
Thank you, Councillor Chan. So Councillor Martin, do you want to come in with now? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Firstly, I want to just sort of thank Will for the very nice donuts we had today up on the hill. Myself and Councillor Raza are up there, so really appreciate the bakery side of and everything else you're doing up there. It's fantastic work. I'm probably going to echo quite a few of the things that you were saying as well. One of the things I've noticed in Ealing, there is a lot of green space. I did wonder also whether or not we could look at what we could be doing with that space, either for allotments or for food growing, on a bigger scale potentially. So that's certainly one thing I would totally agree with you on. The other thing I was wondering about, I mean, in Northolt, which is Northolt West End, where I'm the councillor, there are some schemes on some of the housing estates where we've got raised beds, people are growing food. There is a sort of cookery club that also helps people to understand how best to do stuff with that food, and whether or not there isn't an option to increase that, but also look at, when we are looking at planning permission for bigger developments, maybe we should be thinking about adding in an element of that into all of our developments where there's a reasonable amount of landscaping, and that could be viable. So that was a couple of things I was thinking really just at this stage. Just thought I'd mention that to you all. Thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks. I know in Northfields there's a sizable development coming in, and they've actually allocated some land within that, mainly because it goes to a very narrow point. So they've got an area of land which is very difficult to build in, but it's going to have some growing plots in there. It might be about 1 per 10 flats, but at least they make the acknowledgement. So that's kind of interesting to see that actually happening as part of a planning proposal. And I don't know if Joe or Maria wanted to come in about some of the things that might happen on estates, or thinking about of the development of growing opportunities on estates that the council has the land. That might come in there. And Will, I can see you've got your hand up as well. So Will, did you want to come in?
Yes, it was just another point around, I think, again, remembering where we live and the setting that we're in. And I mentioned in my introduction about co-responsibilities. I think there's, to expand on that a little bit, I think there's something around partnerships, and we know that the council's emissions are very low. What contributes a lot of emissions in the borough is private sector. And I think if we're looking at whether it's the consumption aspect of it, is looking at partnerships with private sectors. So, for example, Farming UK published an article a couple of days ago about a project being set up with McDonald's and I think what is a private agricultural consultancy, but looking at supporting more sustainable agricultural methods of producing meat and also other things. So I think McDonald's is quite an interesting one in that it is a franchise, and so therefore you can have a modicum of influence in that respect. And I think it's, again, being creative. How can we work with some of the big employers and also big private sector companies that rely on food? They sell it. How can we work with them so that they get a local supply of food? What are some of the things that we can do? Some of the business models that we can work up with that at scale to support that? And you mentioned the challenges of allotments providing a consistent food for food banks is difficult. Same with us. We're not anywhere near really a CSA model at the moment because we don't have the consistency of produce, but we will do, and there will be opportunities for others to do the same. So how, again, how do we build up those partnerships and have those connections as well? And that could be something that council can facilitate, but also looking to making the, I suppose, economic and well, whatever situation a bit more amenable so that those things can flourish and can start as well.
Thanks, Will. Councillor Chone, did you have your hand up earlier?
Yeah, I did, but I think Councillor Mohan had his hand up for quite a while, so I'm happy to go after him.
Councillor Mohan? Councillor Mohan, did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I just want to make a few comments and a few questions for ourselves. I found Penny's presentation very interesting and very touching. I had heard a lot about Northfield's allotments, but today the picture she has portrayed that has brought the clear picture before me what it is like to be there and what's happening there. I visited Hornsden farm a couple of years ago, and I was very much impressed by the activities that are happening here. And these places are very kind of rare in the borough. You don't see a lot of that kind going on in the borough, and I think we need to promote this as much as we can. The question that I have for ourselves as a council is that, are we doing enough to promote allotments, for example, and the growth of domestic food? Particularly, are we able to attract young people to the allotments or activity of this kind, or is it mainly the upper age sort of bracket people? Which actually I'm not sure about that. And secondly, many people have got rear gardens. And is there any scheme to promote the growth of vegetables and organic food within people's own homes? People who have big gardens, to help them and educate them, to encourage them. Do we have any scheme in place? And I think that that's equally important, that people who have space of their own, and they don't need to have an allotment as such, and they should be encouraged in terms of education or facilities and so on. And the other thing, in terms of sharing food, any surplus food that the allotment people may have, are there any outlets within the allotment where ordinary people can come and buy or share or sort of have access to that food somehow? Does that need to be encouraged? So these were the comments that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thanks, Lukas and Mohan. Thank you. Councillor Chauhan, are you okay to come in? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I think I had quite a few points on the report as well. So I don't know if it's worth going to that
Sure.
now.
Sure.
I guess I was, Joe, it's about the term planet-friendly diet. I think I would, not to be an academic about it, but to be an academic about it, it's, I think, quite important to be really precise about what we mean about these terms, particularly picking up on a point that I made in the previous meeting. You know, there was a report done by Friends of the Earth today, or I saw it, this recent report, I saw it today, about organizations and corporations really using these big ideas like net zero and, you know, carbon neutral, but actually we're very far from doing that, and the fact that that is part of greenwashing. And what we're trying to do, I suppose it's important to be critical about what we're trying to do, and not just use these terms, you know, and add to that trend in a sense. So I think planet-friendly diet is another one of those that I think is an important term to really, what does that mean? And again, like William was saying, it's also thinking, you know, flagging up very clearly that it's about how food is produced as well, not only the health side of it, that that's what the systems perspective is about, interconnecting all these elements. So that was my point on, one of my points on the report. And I think picking up on what Councillor Mohan said, we have a really important mouthpiece platform to you know, boost education and knowledge around healthy eating, and I know that, you know, I live in an area that is very deprived in London terms, in Ealing terms, in Britain terms. You know, just looking at Southall Broadway and South Road, the number of chicken shops and fried chicken shops that we've got there is in close proximity to high school and to schools, I think is dangerous and irresponsible, because, you know, there are studies that have been done about levels of deprivation and indicators in relation to, you know, fried chicken and fast food shops, and how there's a massive correlation. And I think their licensing could come in, it could be really important. And I think it's about, you know, where do we have control to start reshaping diets and promoting healthy eating and promoting education about that, going into schools, talking about, you know, the important, doing workshops with kids, using our Around Ealing magazine. I think an interesting example I found in my research on CSAs was actually the interconnection between CSAs and sort of community organizations. And one of the most interesting was a CSA, I think it was in the north of the country somewhere, that was supplying food directly to school canteens. It's organic, low food miles, and they were doing workshops. They were bringing kids onto their farm, sort of, I guess, what William is thinking in the future for Horsenden as well. But how can we start creating that now in terms of who we're providing, who we're hiring for catering and procurement? How can we put those healthy eating, planet-friendly concepts into place in terms of who's catering right now? Are there regulations and norms that we can say, actually, we want, like the report said, a meat-free Monday, or, you know, we want produce to be locally sourced or within X amount of miles, having, I guess, making food education a real center point of children's education. And I mean, I will stop here, but I think it's a really important anecdote. My mum is a nursery teacher, and she said to me that kids in the nursery for many years think that fruit and vegetables just come in packages from Tesco's. Like there's such a disconnect in our youth, in our children, in understanding where food comes from. And it's almost even more astounding when you're an immigrant child whose family has farming heritage and links, and then that's getting lost somewhere along the way. And I think that's, I would say, William, if I could make a small suggestion to the many that you've got going on there, there's a wealth of knowledge from, I know my family's from Punjab. We all have links with farming. You know, many of our South Asian communities do, and there's a wealth of knowledge there that I think is really interesting to think about how we transfer what our grandparents know, what our parents have known, to what, you know, what we're doing now. And that journey, I think, is so important in terms of the borough's makeup as well. But yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Councillor Shahan. No, I think there's some really important points, some really big structural issues like school catering, education, family connections, and disconnection, because it's almost like we expect food to be packaged in plastic and to be sanitized. So yeah, no, I think there's absolutely a whole range of thoughts and ideas there that encompass big organizational things for us as a borough, but also individual understandings. And it's, you know, there's lots of stuff there. I mean, I think my perception of food when I first thought about it was air miles, but it's absolutely, we need to dispel that myth. It's just about air miles for travel of food. It's a whole range of different ideas. So I think there's a huge amount to go on there. I don't know if Joe or Maria want to come back with some of those points that Councillor Jones mentioned.
I'm happy to address those. I couldn't agree with you more, Councillor Shahan, about the use of language and how important that is. So for us, we'll find new language, but it is about making language accessible as well to all of our audiences, and so I think we definitely want to incorporate the food systems, the sustainable food systems language in there, because I think it's impossible to not view it as such. It isn't exclusively about diet at all. And that's not what our focus will be at all. So I completely agree with that point. And there's a big piece of work for us to do around engagement. And we've said it with the strategy as a whole, but in particular, I think food is a really great point of engagement for people. I mean, everyone needs to eat. And I think there's a tremendous amount for all of us to learn about this aspect, whether it be the point that Will raised about that not all meat is bad, but you know, that we should be moving towards just less of it and better in our diets, or you know, that sadly that some young people think that fruit comes in packaging already. Like, yeah, there's connections to be made there. I think there's a lot of great work that we're uncovering around stuff that schools are doing already. And I think that's one of the ideas that we're looking at as a potential for introducing a food partnership model in the borough, to sort of help take all those things that are happening sort of everywhere and give them some point of connection to share back ideas and ways that they've engaged. And we're hearing loads about small, work that's being done on a small scale, very locally for various schools, such as the turning their playground space into food growing spaces and things like that. And I'm sure that, them doing it in Acton, they would love to do it in Northolt as well, but it's just really about helping make those connections for them. So I'm hoping that we can do some of that work, if not, in the development of the strategy, but as a legacy of the strategy and as the work that we get on with and do. And also the big piece around schools catering. When we think about what the council can actually control in terms of spend, we do the procurement on behalf of the schools food consortium. I think it is the catering consortium. So that is a big area where we could do some influencing and make sure that we bring through the values that we want to help us with our climate commitments. So you'll absolutely see that appearing in the strategy as well. So yeah, great comments and great contributions from everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the discussions we had with the Greenwich Co-op Development Agency, they had almost like a 3-point strap line, which was environment sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. So thinking about some of those points all mean that we need to, like pay people the right wages, that it's about the environment, but we're not going to, but it also crosses over with social sustainability. And there's often like a Venn diagram of overlapping connections between health, between well-being, mental health, between exercise, between environment, and it's not an exclusivity. So I think that was quite how they tried, it was stressed, they tried to keep that on a par, those 3 points, environment, social and economic sustainability, rather than thinking one has to have an overriding priority over another. So that was interesting part of the discussion with Claire Pritchard from the Greenwich today, just stressing that point that came out. I've got Councillor Chan, you've got your hand up again, fine. And just if any other councillors want to come in, or any of the participants as well, please as well, because Councillor Chan, yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to keep talking about this. There's a problem with having experts in the panel. I think the other key point that I noted down was, Paul's touched on it, the intersection between food security with those who are particularly vulnerable in our society. I think, again, from the research that I did about CSAs, what was really interesting was the way they were very quickly able to plug in during the pandemic to those who were vulnerable and food insecure. And I think the council's got a wealth of data due to the pandemic about those who are food insecure, who have been in touch with Ealing Together. And I wonder if it would be important, well, I think it would be important to use that data and work with people who are on universal credit, in particular, those who are using food banks, to understand, from what I've been reading in the press and from casework, universal credit is hardly sufficient to cover basic costs. What are those people eating? How are they eating? And I know that Jack Monroe did a lot of interesting stuff about people who are on really, really low income, on benefits, how they can eat healthily. I think it's really important to create a stream of work where we're working with the most vulnerable. And I think that's one of the only ways that we're going to really tackle the structural element of food poverty that we're dealing with in the borough, and see how we can lobby for increases in universal credit through what we're doing as well, particularly looking at the angle from food poverty, thinking about how we can link up those people to organisations in the borough who can help them become more food secure, and importantly, looking at the importance of health as well, and whether there's ways of prioritising potentially their access to green spaces. I know that Penny mentioned that there's no means test sort of in place for allotments, but I wonder whether there could be spaces where we say, okay, well, how about getting out, planting food, growing your own food as well, as a supplement to what you have, trying to see that as a way to like deal with mental health. Obviously, people are going to be very constrained by working and being, being very time limited. People have families, but I just wonder if there are creative ways to engage with people who are on the real, really on the brink and on the margins of our society, sort of socioeconomically speaking, and how we can support them, their access to food, and make that more secure in a way.
Sure. Councillor Martin, you mentioned about things that were happening, the estates in North Hall, West End. I don't know if there's any points, or I don't know if there's anything that can be added in there about, because I'm very conscious about, we have a borough which has disparity of incomes like any other borough, but that this isn't seen as a comfortable area that they have time and energy to be in allotments, but how can we make that accessible in areas across the borough, and how do we get that connection going and interest rather than top down? How do we get people to think about that could be an option that they might have? I don't know, any thoughts?
I mean, I do think these things often sort of evolve the other way around. So it's the community that comes up with these ideas rather than us, really. But the other was to give people an idea of what to do with food and how to cook it well, and I thought that was a really good idea and a good scheme. The other thing I was wondering about, those sort of, a few people have sort of touched on it, but I've got an allotment myself on Framfield, and last year or the year before, I think they created a community allotment plot that was a shared plot, and it seems to me there are options for things like that as well. So traditional model is for a family or perhaps a couple of friends to get together and have an allotment, but the idea of maybe expanding that into other areas where we do make them available perhaps to schools or to other community groups might be another thing to think about more systematically. And I work at a university, and we do have a roof garden, and we're fortunate because we've got catering as part of the university, that we can actually work with them, and therefore they can model their menu about what we have available. So it's always difficult with, I think both Will and Penny have talked about, the reliability of supply. If you can almost reverse it and be working with people that will model their menu about what you're going to have available, then it starts to become more possible, I think. So it's maybe looking at how we can link those sort of things up. And some things which are, for example, mint, we always have enough mint to provide all the mint for the bar. So it's things like that that make it possible. So I think there's ways around it, but you have to work together as a community to do that sort of thing. So it's joining those things together, I think, that might help us. But I definitely think the idea, just going back to Northolt for a minute, of having that locally produced food, people can see it, they do understand it, and then if you can develop that into showing them how to use it, is a really sort of positive way of trying to change sort of eating habits, as well as having that really sort of as Penny said, almost zero miles to your plate idea.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And Will, I see you've got your hand up there. Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow on from that point, Councillor Martin, by the way, I passed on your complimentary comments about the shop. Was it donuts that you got today?
Yeah, it was today, yeah. Eggs on Saturday as well.
Yeah, those are our chickens, yeah. So we change around. We have a couple of different baked things and stuff, so the menu changes. But anyway, so to your point about sort of seeing and growing things, I think what, as some of you might have realised when you've been to the farm, is that the queue, unfortunately, is right alongside the growing beds. And come a couple of months, that will be blooming. And we'll, this Saturday we're putting in strawberries, and we'll be doing that as the queue is there. I think sometimes the challenge with allotments is that they are either tucked into enclaves behind residential properties. You don't see them. So I think that's not always the case, by the way. I appreciate that. And you've gone down North Hills Avenue and you see the allotment there, and it's amazing. And it gives me a lot of inspiration sometimes as well. But I think it's making growing food visible, and that can be just having that site. It helps with kids realizing, oh, actually, oh look, they're growing tomatoes there. Doesn't come from a packet from a supermarket or whatever. So again, I think visibility is really important. And just to touch on the kind of triumvirate of social, economic and environmental, I'm a strong believer of, you can make environmental change by talking to people's back pockets a little bit, and also by giving them access to it. Talking to them through a TV screen or something else, or big policy gestures, people don't really get it half the time, and it's difficult to try to join the dots. So I think trying to really kind of focus in on what are the environmental benefits to you as an individual. So it's not necessarily just maybe making over land over to allotments or to us, or whatever it may be, to growing food, but actually to habitat, to environmental habitat. And I think, again, some of the lessons coming out of the pandemic, people have been much more aware of their wildlife and their surroundings. So it's having those benefits. And then what are some of the economic benefits that we could drive? Is it, more inward investment or other people wanting to get involved, and how that drives the local economy through those measures, through those means, whether again it's or it's supporting biodiversity that might bring some other economic benefit as well. So I think the visibility is really important, and as I think, again, trying to attach those three things, I think is really key.
Thanks, Will. Penny, I see you've got your hand up there. Oh, you might be muted, Ella. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I just wanted to say in response to Councillor Martin that the small starter plots that I mentioned, they are community plots. We have 3 plots on the site which are divided into small plots, and that's where you start off. You have a bed there, so you immediately meet other people, and you sort of you're your own little community within the site, and that does work very well on lots and lots of different ways. If you are going to make a plot available, as we have done in the past, we at one point west side, the Young People's Centre, which is in the St John's area of Churchfield Road, they had one of our plots, and what the key thing there is that the quality of the supervision needs to be excellent, and you can't allow it to become somewhere where, well, the bottom line was the young people appeared to be not as interested as the people doing the supervising, shall we say. So, these things have been tried, are tried elsewhere. But certainly that idea of bringing a group of people together who each have a little space, it really works. It gives them that, it gives people that introduction. But the thing that sort of is coming out to me from so many of the comments that are being made this evening is that there seems to be a lot of consensus that there's lots of good ideas here, and that there are lots of good initiatives in the borough. But if you want more of them, where's the space going to come from? That's what I don't really understand. Where are these pieces of land? I would love to see, Ealing is well known as a borough where there's lots of green space. I'd love to see even more. I would love to see these community projects. I would love to see more allotments. And I do think that they would be well used, but I'm not at all clear where this space is.
An absolutely valid point. Where is the space going to come from? I know there might be a possibility of looking at some of the housing estates, but that could be quite a painful discussion about if you've got kids kicking a ball around on a patch of lawn, how much of that space should be given to another purpose, growing food. There are some conflicts sometimes. But it's absolutely right. You know, we're in a populous city with a lot of pressure on land. So yes, that will be a difficult decision a lot of time, I think, and I don't deny that at all. Councillor Martin, do you...
I was just going to say there is a lot of land between Hanwell and Southall, which currently is fields, etc., and some of it's golf courses. Okay, we won't be able to steal the golf courses probably, but you know there are lots of patches of land that seem to be sort of fallow, basically. And I'm not saying that doesn't have its own value, which it indeed does, but you could look at the possibility of combining things in those sort of areas. For sure. And Northolt as well, to be honest. There's parts of Northolt where it's not always very easy. It's not land that's easy to build on, but it's still there and it's still green land. And I think you probably could come up with some ideas for areas in Northolt where you could grow food as well.
So, Joe, in the report, it talks about mapping in terms of what's happening in the borough, but part of that mapping is here's an opportunity of various patches of land. I mean, I can think of some land not far off Ealing Broadway, which I think has just been held by a developer and it's now just held. And if you said, well, if you're not building on it, could we have it for 10 years for? But I don't know. But doing a stock take of land that could have an opportunity there. I don't know if that might be part of it, or working in conjunction with planning department to identify areas.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. The mapping activity that we've talked to some specialists in this area about has sort of a lot of different dimensions, it was a great conversation, because we initially thought about mapping mapping the connections of organizations and the work that's being done to help us do some gap identification and connect what's happening a little bit more closely in some circumstances. But then we started to talk about physical mapping and the potential for that to be a process that the community could have access to. So I don't know if any of you have used any of the engagement tools for any consultation exercises where you can sort of drop pins onto a map and make suggestions for. It's used a lot of times for like infrastructure improvements and things like that. But why couldn't we put layers on a map where people said, what about this little plot of land that hasn't been used for 10 years? So I think that is a piece that is sounding from this discussion like a really important aspect of how we scope that work. So it's not just the community organization mapping, but the physical location of opportunity mapping as well.
Yeah, sure. I just sort of highlight that it's about 8:30 now. So I don't know if any members have got, or any participants here have got any points that haven't been raised. It'd be good to try and think about some of the outline draft objectives. Do we want to contribute to some of those, or any points in the report that need to be brought out? So I just sort of flag that up because it's about 8:30. Councillor Chan, you've got your hand there. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't know, Joe, if you managed to capture the objectives and ideas that I was throwing up during the meeting, but if not, I can send you an email with them after, so I won't repeat those. But I think another exercise that might be useful is, I understand other areas around the country have been doing multi-stakeholder sort of conferences and workshop days. I know your report mentions working with other people in University of West London, but I wonder whether something like that might be useful for Ealing, like a discussion day where we bring together different stakeholder groups to have a discussion about around our objectives as well, once we've got them solidified a bit more.
Yeah, I think that is okay to come back.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely. I didn't share much of the process of what we're looking at right now, but we've invited a group together to be our working group of members of the community with various sort of perspectives on the food system. So they'll help us shape, we'll have 5 different meetings that cover a specific topic. And so they'll help us shape the ideas. And then from that point, we do plan to do consultation with the public. I think we're aiming for May to get some version out to the public to have the public give feedback on how we've done in terms of scoping that out. So.
Sorry, Councillor, could I just say, in terms of ensuring engagement, that was the point that I thought of earlier when you talked about the survey that was done with 70-something% of population, to be a bit sensitive about like community languages and things like that, so that we ensure we get, the BAME community from South or other parts of Greenford involved in these discussions as well. And if you could provide a bit more background on who are the community members or community groups that will be participating in this. It doesn't need to be now, it could be later, just to, so we get a sense of who's being represented at this discussion table.
In the report, there's a community mapping diagram. Are those the type of organisations, I think it's on page 7, of people that would be part of that community consultation, involvement, engagement?
Yes, sorry, I'm just scrolling to that grouping. So I think that broadly, I don't want to put Maria on the spot unless you're available, Maria, but we've had loads of sort of initial conversations with most of the people on this grid here. And Maria, if you are available, if you can come in on the idea of who is sort of on the working group.
Yeah, absolutely. So the working group includes people, so we've got Cultivate London, UWL, we've got Bubble and Squeak, which is a school-based community organisation in Acton, I believe. We have Mind Food are coming along. The chairman of the allotment group that Penny mentioned earlier is coming along. Will, who is invited today, is coming. We've got a lady called Rachel Pepper who works for an organisation called Artification, who do have some growing space, and then we have Mary Horsham, who is involved in food work within schools. So there is quite a varied group. I think we've also got somebody from the Orchard Trail, the Hannover Orchard Trail. So the group is quite varied. And then it's also a number of individuals from different council officers from different parts of the council attending.
Does this group represent the borough across east and west, north and south? Does it represent different demographic profiles, BAME groups? Has it got that representation there as well?
I would have to have a look at that a little bit more detail, but I think it's got quite good across the borough in terms of the different areas, but I would have to kind of have a little bit more in depth on the demographics.
Sure. I know when we spoke with Claire from Greenwich Co-op Development Agency, she'd done a lot of work with Southall Manor, which has got a catering, cooking dimension side with it there. And I know the diagram mentioned Sri Guru Singh Sabha. I've got my pronunciation right. I hope it's, so there's an idea. So just to make sure that we have that balance there, or at least invites are put out to give people the opportunity to make sure that happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Councillor Mohan, you indicated a little while ago.
Just a quick one, Chair. Concerns have been expressed here about getting more spaces for allotments. I agree with that's a real issue. Ideally, I would like space for more allotments in the borough. I think as a council, we should give our commitment to maintain what we already have. We shouldn't allow ourselves to give the allotment spaces for other projects or build houses or building houses, etc. At any cost. So I think we should commit ourselves to do that.
Yeah, I think that relates well to what Penny was saying, because the owner of the land for Northfield's allotment is actually a housing provider. They just so happen to own some allotments, but they were proposing to build several blocks of flats. So there is that tension. They're a charitable housing provider who also have lands for allotments, and several locations in the Northfield area. So they have a tension about providing affordable homes and that. So, but I think it is part of, and we mentioned at the last meeting about how planning policy was really integral to supporting the aims of climate. And it's got to connect in and dovetail sufficiently tight that the policy we have supports our aims. So that's really important, that's all in there. How I'm just thinking about timing, because we've got a lot of, I mean, the report mentions, we talked about some bigger structural issues. I think it's taken as read like there'll be work with the schools and that sort of structural part of the council, that contractual side, to make sure that we're looking at procurement of food for schools, we're looking at the food diet, and I think that's in the report that that's going to be taking place. There's also the role for the departments within the council, like health safety, who connect with businesses. I think there could be a role that business connection could be used to highlight a discussion and an opportunity for an avenue into a business to highlight opportunities for sustainability with their products. Although having said that, when I was teaching, I used to think, well, can't teachers teach this? And I used to think, yes, we have a curriculum as well as teaching about the whole else. But I think looking at where we touch people and businesses around, and make contact. So having that food safety, making that contact with people and being allowed to raise about sustainability should be part of that. And it's acknowledged in the report. I think that's really important. But are there any other sort of recommendations or anything that we can sort of pin down a little bit now? I'm just thinking about getting something a bit more substantive to start to move things to any recommendations or any comments that might lead to recommendation. Councillor Martin?
Yeah, thanks. So just going back briefly on the panel that you're setting up, did you have Building Bridges on that list, which are the organisation that did all that work in Northolt?
No.
So if not, why not? I suggest them. I mean, that's another example of how we help obviously the community to develop these ideas themselves, and we did give them award funding, and you know, it's another thing to think about, is how we get financing to groups that are developing these really good ideas. And certainly there's a report on award forum, I think it was in June 19, if you want to have a look at it, of what all the work they were doing. Might be useful to have a look at as a model for, you know, maybe other ideas like that elsewhere.
The GLA has several pots of money for starting projects off, 10 to 15,000 pounds, which if you've got nothing, it's quite, you know, it allows you to sort of make an experiment. So one of the deadlines was actually this week just gone, but I think a lot of times small organizations just don't know what funding pots are available. So I think that probably should be part of the mapping exercise there, to look at, make sure that organizations know what funding is around, because that often you just don't hear. It becomes happenstance when somebody hears about those funding opportunities. So I think that should connect with the mapping exercise and funding opportunities. I know there's a link in the paper that links through to fundings that's offered by the GLA, that links economy and food and incubator program. That was on page 7 of the report as well. So I think that could be really important to link up. Yeah, so any other things that we can think about tying up some sort of recommendations there? Any other thoughts that could add in?
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Bustill, yeah.
Yeah, it was something that William had said and made me think, and I'm not sure if it currently happens, is having projects in each of the borough schools, so pupils are growing their own food, and to make them realise how it's grown, where it's coming from, to make them also realise that carrots are wonky and cucumbers are not straight and potatoes are different sizes. And then getting them to try some of the own food that they've grown, because I remember, God, this really does make me sound old, does this? Back in '96, when I first started catering college, there were a couple of people who I started with who didn't know what a carrot was. So I think it'd be good from early stages, the education, secondary school, to give some kids the projects, and hopefully then maybe that'll entice younger people to take up allotments. Something that Councillor Chauhan said about licensing, particularly of like chicken shops near schools, I find that quite shocking that, and it was something that I was speaking to about a work colleague a couple of years ago, that they used to go out the school gates to get pizzas and fried chicken because it was sold to them cheaply. And, that isn't, to me, doing anything for the health and well-being, particularly as the growing up of people's diets. So I think licensing, if it's at all possible, to be looked at this, particularly near schools. And also something that Penny had said about space for community allotments, community growing, so on and so forth. And I thought about one place that I think is underutilized, and part of this area is practically a waste of space, and that is in Warren Farm. I think Warren Farm is an area that could really benefit of allotments there. There's a part of Warren Farm that's currently derelict and with plastic bins still lying about that were burned a few years ago. And I think we could do a lot with that space. So I think, as Councillor Martin said, there are spaces in the west of the borough where we can introduce more allotments for people to grow their own food. They're my suggestions, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. I see Will had his hand up, and then Councillor Chauhan.
It's to, I hope this is not labouring a point, so apologies. Coming back onto the education piece, yeah, I think I mentioned at the start one of my aspirations is to set up an education programme at the farm, which focuses on the activities at the farm and teaching kids about soil and very much about sort of eat what you grow. I think looking at it a little bit more widely, is one of my other hats is I'm training to be a forest school leader as well, so I'm quite interested in outdoor education. And I think one of the importances of something else that's coming out of the pandemic is just the realization of how important it is for the more holistic education approach that kids, more holistic education kids can receive as a result of just being outdoors in nature and experiencing what is there. Mm-hmm. So again, coming back to you talked about social, environmental, economic aspect. I think, again, and looking at the workshops that I've been kindly invited to contribute to as well, it's all well and good us talking about how we grow food, but I think it's really important to have the social aspect in that and the input in that, and how communities actually develop or organise themselves, whether it to be growing food, to be supporting one another in other means, whether it be for health as well. I think that it's really important to draw those connections. And so having those many voices in the room that can draw that, I think, will give us a much richer strategy and something that's a little bit more joined up, rather than it just being saying the theme of food just focused on food. It's what is the social input into that, and how does that then support the goal of providing locally produced food that's accessible, that's affordable, and can benefit everyone.
Thank you. Yeah. And was looking. Thank you, Will. Was there any other hands up? Oh, I've got Will. I've just got your hand up. Councillor Chohan. Yeah.
Sorry again. Listening to Councillor Busuttil gave me another idea. How about working with the canals and the river trust? I know in Mexico they'd have a chinampas, sort of using shallow lakes to do sort of agriculture, and our waterways are, I mean, it's part of a big regeneration program that the Canal and River Trust is doing. So maybe that's another interesting creative solution to think about in times where we're land scarce, if we want to call it that, in our cities. We've got an amazing canal network, whether it's floating barges or I know that there's the Canal and River Trust has been looking for ideas to get people to start using the canals more as well. So could be another sort of project to think about, another pot of funding, maybe another way to do it in a joined up fashion, and that would really encourage biodiversity in our canal system too. So could be another idea.
I know the Park Services have been working with an organisation linked with the canals. I'm not sure exactly here, but they did get an awful lot of funding for developing the canal area. That was last year. I think I attended a scrutiny meeting, the leisure scrutiny meeting, and the Park Service were there and saying how they've got a lot of funding for this particular aspect. I don't know the scope of that, but it was quite substantial, like hundreds of thousands. So that could give an opportunity for, if redevelopment is happening, how that is going, or what steer or input that could have. Yeah, that could be an opportunity there. How are we doing with that? Because it's now about 10 to 9. So I'm just thinking, if it's okay with that, I can take away and try and formalize some of these and then circulate, rather than trying to do it on the hoof here and now, and come back up with and then circulate these, because we're not at the set. Previously, last meeting we had a bit of a deadline to get some recommendations in with cabinet and things, whereas we don't have quite that pressure now. So I can try and put these into more succinct form and synthesize these a bit and circulate amongst the panel. So Councillor Young, I see you've got your hands up, and Joe. So Councillor Young, do you want to come in, and then Joe?
Yeah, I've kept quiet up to now, but most of the suggestions I've heard really aren't practical, or they're already being done. One thing we could look at is, are there any unused allotments still?
Sure.
No, there are some which are designated allotments.
Yeah.
Allotments which are in council ownership can't be sold without there's quite a rigmarole you have to go through to sell them.
Yeah.
Slightly different with the Northfields allotments, because they're privately owned.
Yeah.
They're not restricted in the same way. Because when I was younger, there used to be allotments on both sides of Northfields Avenue. One side was built on, and the other side would have been built on, until people stepped in and stopped it happening. But I think there are some unused allotments in Pitshanger.
Right. Okay.
The A40.
I think so.
Back of Neville Road.
Right.
Behind Neville Road, there's an area there. It's not very good land. It would need a lot of working, but there are unused allotments there.
I mean, if we can find the locations, I know there was some in Ealing Common that Ealing Transition adopted, and now it's a thriving allotment, but was previously very much underused. So they do, and as it was mentioned, sometimes allotments are tucked away, and it could quite happen there may be ones which aren't used. So doing that audit of land and coming up with the locations and suggestions, absolutely, if they're being underutilized and need to be given that bit of vitality. And that's what happened in the Ealing Common ward on the Trees estate, and you'd never know it was there. It's just down a little alleyway, and behind, surrounded by houses, there's a whole area of allotment that's been revitalized by Ealing Transition. So it does exist. Absolutely right. Thank you for pitching that.
There are some people still around who would probably know where these are.
Yeah, it's finding those people, but any bit of land where you think, if you can give us the location or pass it on to Joe, then that can go part of that mapping exercise. Yeah.
So the one I can think of is behind Neville Road.
Neville Road. All right. Penny, did you want to come in, and then Joe?
I just wanted to say, entirely out of self-interest, can some protection be given to allotment sites so that they can't be built on?
They are protected.
Well, Northfields isn't.
That's in private ownership.
Yes, exactly.
And even then, there's the planning restrictions on the building on the allotments because they're open space. And planning should protect open space. But there have been recent examples where, for example, building of the new school on Hanger Lane, trying to build on the Durston House playing fields, Gurnell, where they want to build on open space, where that important rule has been breached.
I mean, it is, I don't know, planning can be asked to give advice and give us comments about what the parameters could be or how much a local plan can restrict development on open land.
Well, it's not the local plan, it's the GLA.
Yes.
You try to build on metropolitan open land, and the allotments are metropolitan open land. Then the GLA has to be involved.
Yeah.
They turned down the Durston House playing fields development because they didn't think that the benefit outweighed the loss.
Sure.
The same thing may happen at Gurnell.
Yeah, by that I mean asking planning officers to come back with what our scope for limitations could be. And I accept the point that often in the tier of planning regulations, there's the London plan and national regulations, but I don't know what scope we have.
I think it's more down to political will now.
Yeah, so we can see how we can go with that. So Penny, absolutely not self-interest, you know, it's a completely valid point, but I understand where you're coming from. Joe, do you want to come in with some points here?
Yeah, we definitely are involving planning, just to address that point. We're definitely involving planning and the working group to make sure that we explore all of the possibilities for the powers that the council has to provide more food growing spaces. So that will definitely be covered as part of the work that we're doing. And thank you all for your really great contributions. I have more notes than I expected to have from tonight's meeting. So I'm really grateful to have all the contributions. Going back to the point of the working group, we did our best to reach out to all of the folks that are working in the council in areas related to food. But in the report, I mentioned that that we do this Good Food for London reporting every year. And one of the challenges and why we sort of are always in the middle of the pack in terms of the league table is because the council doesn't have great visibility of all of the work that's being done on food systems. And so we put our hands up and say we're absolutely limited in terms of who we know that's working on food in the borough. We have a lot of groups that we have been able to identify, but if this panel has recommendations to put forward to bring out whether they be geographic or ethnic voices that we aren't hearing, then please, we'd love to hear from that, because we've tried to do our best at sort of sourcing folks that could give us time, but there's room at the table for sure. Mm-hmm. So, and yeah, if there are ideas around the objectives or the draft objectives that are in the report that you'd like to comment on, or additions to that we should be considering, because we'll be co-developing this strategy with the community. We're putting forward a few objectives, but completely different ones could come to the table on that first meeting. So that's a really fluid list, and we welcome your comments on that as well.
Thank you, Joe, for coming through that. If I'll just try and give a bit of a summary of how we have gone from tonight. I mean, I was really surprised the sort of breadth of the food profile, from great big contracts, school and catering, and the regulatory role that the council has in terms of food safety. Then we have down, you know, like independent organisations, Horsenden Farm, which is sort of business organised, and then to the individual, maybe it's a plot holder, so that whole scope, and also the delivery side of the services of the council. Like, we've taken great strides in waste management and food waste management to make sure that we're salvaging food rather than donating it to landfill. But there's more to do on that, and that's recognised that is a priority area for Greener Ealing going forward. And also looking at food wastage, that there's activity happening to rescue food from waste. So Felix and other organisations are doing activity there. So it's that breadth of a subject that I didn't realise from coming into this. I do think that breadth will be a challenge for the council in terms of officer time, resourcing. But sometimes, as I think it's been when we spoke with Greenwich Co-op Development Agency, seeing a market stall go into a business with a wholesale arm that's got employees now, and multiple market stalls started about 7 years ago. And it did have some trial and tribulations and some fails. And I don't think we should be troubled by having a few fails or a few false starts in some of these events, especially if we're trying to go from bottom up and grow things. And we shouldn't be holding back from we'll trip up a couple of times. But I think if we can be that enabler to prompt people that there are resources there, that would be a great start to something to build on. So we have some big issues within the council that the council has moderate control. The waste management, the school contracts and things which we can, push forward. But we've also got lots of other areas where it's going to be maybe a slow burn, but that slow burn's okay. And, as long as we're getting there and making sure we're getting that project out there, that we've got some real positive things that are happening. And it's great. I'll try and make a concerted effort to get to Horsenden Hill, if nothing but for the bagels and for the muffins and stuff. But no, I think there's been quite a fulsome discussion about a whole range of aspects of the food. And it's been quite surprising as I've been researching this and looking at a lot of the links that were in the report there. It's a big challenging area, I think. And not least of each is people's perception about changing diets, and that very, very personal activity, which is often discussed at schools, but we need to make it sure it's not just at schools, but for the whole family to think about what we're doing for that, which will be quite a challenge in itself. So what I can take away from it, I will summarise some of the sort of recommendations and put them on a bit more of a readable form. I'll send them to Councillor Buttersall to sort of go through them and Joe, and then circulate it to the panel. So rather than debate some of the points now, because that would take quite a bit of time, I think. Is that okay? So can I thank Penny and can I thank Will for giving so generous of their time, especially Will, because you said you'd be here till 8 and it's now 9. And I'd just like to say there's several claps of applause appeared on the icon. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your contributions. Penny, thank you for letting me know the statistics about what an allotment could support, because it's quite revealing when you say that could support a family for so many months. And that was government policy. So, it's kind of revealing that. So thank you for bringing that. And thank you, Will. And it was great to hear, because I'd heard the name, but I didn't know the details of Horsenden Farm. So thank you for being so generous with your times tonight. Thank you. And thank you to Joe and Maria for your preparing the report and the work you're doing. We've got some other bits of the agenda item, which now are just sort of future planning, future meetings. So don't feel obliged to hang around. If you want to have a bit of an earlier night, which is fine. We've just got some administration that points on the agenda to go through. So thank you very much. And thank you for everybody for your contributions tonight. Okay, so we're going to go into the work programme of the agenda. So thank you very much, Penny. Thank you, Will. Thank you. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Maria. Haji, are you there? Yeah. So we've got the panel's work programme, pages 31, 38 of the agenda pack.
Yes, Chair. Yep. So the next meeting, which is the last meeting of the panel, has got energy efficiency and the panel's draft summary final report scheduled to be considered that evening. So So the panel will have a draft report with some proposed recommendations, which the panel then need to finalize. And of course, whatever the discussions are around the energy efficiency item will then, of course, be included in the revised version, which I'll put together in consultation with you and the Vice Chair.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we just need approval for the work program. So I think that's okay. It's all set out. The dates are already there. That's okay, yeah? Is that right, Haji? Yeah, it's just
Yes.
Everybody to confirm.
Yep.
So I see lots of nodding heads. By acclamation, I take that's okay. So thank you very much for that. There's no other points on the work program, are there? I don't think so. It's all agreed.
Yeah.
And just the date of the next meeting, which I've got as Thursday, the 29th of April is the next meeting. So that's just to give everybody notice of that. Is that okay? Any other points there, Haji? Anything else to go in? I don't think so.
No, that's it for today.
Yeah. So can I thank everybody for your contributions? Thank you very much, Councillor Chairman, especially. And thank you for chipping in. And thank you for lots of other people coming in with their points. I've learned lots of things that were happening in other parts of the borough, which I didn't know about, which was great to hear about. So thank you very much. And it is just gone 9 o'clock. So at that point, thank you for all your contributions tonight. And I'll circulate some draft recommendations, so you'll have those shortly. Okay. Thank you very much.